into existence by Abe Lincoln, and its whole goal was to disseminate useful information on subjects connected with agriculture. And at the time, that naturally included nutrition, because people ate food and food grew on farms, and it was just this nice symbiotic relationship between farmers and people who ate their food. And so at the time, there was no conflict of interest for the USDA to be telling people what to eat, because our knowledge of nutrition was so deficient at that time that people, to tell people what to eat, it was just like you have to eat a variety of food and you have to eat a lot of it, and that's how you stay healthy, and we can't tell you anything beyond that. And so that kind of message was a boon for farmers and for public health, because people eating more food was great for the people and it was great for farmers. So back in the day when the USDA first came out, everything was kosher with the way they were doing stuff. And our first food guide actually came out in 1916, and it was called Food for Young Children. There's a picture of the cover right over there on the left. And it was shortly followed up the next year. It was published How to Select Foods for the Slightly Older Crowd. And back then there were 5 food groups. One was milk and meat, one was cereals, one was vegetables and fruits, one was fats and fatty foods. That was actually a food group you're supposed to eat a lot of. And another was sugars and sugary foods. So sugar also had its own food group. And that's just a testimony, again, to our lack of knowledge about what we should be eating and what we shouldn't be eating. So everyone was just like, well, just eat a lot of everything. And the emphasis back then was on whole, fresh milk, especially for children. So this was way before the fat-phobic years. Everyone felt that fat was very nourishing, butter was very important in the diet, and that was actually believed to keep people healthy back then, before things changed radically. And then during the Great Depression, the USDA was still rooting for Team Human Health, and it was publishing shopping guides for different cost levels, 4 different tiers of income levels, so that no matter how much money you had, people would have ideas of what they should be buying, how they could afford to eat nutritionally well during that difficult era. And for example, this is the kind of thing that they were publishing. This I think was from probably, sometime during the Great Depression. This was a week's supply of vegetables and fruits for an average family. So they drew out pictures and people were supposed to look at that and say, okay, this is kind of what we should be buying. Same thing for milk and meat, similar foods. Here's what an average family would be eating over the course of the week. And just for comparison's sake, this is an image that was taken more recently from A Hungry Planet. This is what this particularly American family eats during a week. So I personally have an issue with foods that are neon green. I don't think that that should ever exist. But this is just to see the difference. It's kind of horrifying, honestly. And not only that, but for decades, butter was its own food group. Over here, people said you should be eating lots of this every single day for vitamin A. It was important. And of course, did that make people fat? No. In fact, if you look at our ads today, we have all sorts of how to lose weight ads. Back then, back when butter was a food group, I'm not saying correlation is causation, but we had stuff like this. People were like, oh, I'm too skinny, I need to gain weight. I don't want to be skinny anymore. This was all over the place. No one was thinking, oh, I should lose weight, because they didn't really have that kind of problem. But of course, butter makes us fat, right? And then during World War II, things started changing a little bit, because when the US was on the cusp of war, about 40% of the people who were potentially going to be recruits for the Army were getting rejected. And a third of those people were getting rejected for nutritional reasons. 1 in 5 men was rejected from joining the Army because of dental defects, in large part due to bad nutrition. And so the president at the time decided, well, okay, we need to do something about that to boost national defense. So he actually held a giant conference and convened the National Academy of Sciences and some other people to figure out what to do to improve America's nutrition and make us equipped for war. And so in 1941, the National Academy of Sciences created the first set of recommended dietary allowances, or RDAs. And the first batch was basically just goals for protein, calories, innate vitamins and minerals. And that was the first time we'd really set numbers on what we should be eating and how much. And we sort of like pulled the focus away from foods as a thing into foods as a collection of nutrients. And that was a big shift for America. And so the first food guide after that was called the Basic 7. Is anyone here old enough to remember this? I mean, you don't have to raise your hand, I guess, if you don't want to out yourself. But this was in place from 1943 to 1955. And it was that food wheel, it's the wheel kind of thing looking at the top. And it was a good effort on the part of the USDA, but it was horribly confusing because the way they set up their food groups was just based on nutrients instead of like logic. And so one food group, for instance, consisted of potatoes, fruits that aren't citrus, and vegetables that aren't yellow or green. That's one food group. Another one was raw cabbage, oranges, tomatoes, grapefruit, and leafy green vegetables. Then another food group was yellow and green vegetables, except for cabbage and leafy greens, because they were in the other food group. And so people were having these posters and stuff, and they were looking at it, and they were just disregarding it, because they were like, well, I don't know what to do with that, so I'm going to eat whatever I want. And not surprisingly, the USDA had to scrap that a few years later. And in 1956, does anyone remember the Basic Four, maybe? Was anyone raised on this? Yeah, this one was a little more popular as well. This was created in 1956 when the USDA realized, okay, we have to really simplify it because people aren't listening to us at all. And so there's only 4 food groups in this one. They're, again, very simple. One was milk, one was meat, one was vegetables and fruit, and one was cereals and grains. And so that was it. That was all that it consisted of. And people had an easier time with that. It was taught in classrooms, very simple, but the main problem was that there were no advice about sugar, fats, calories, sodium, etc. And during this time, American scientists, a few in particular, were kind of getting on this bandwagon of, well, I think we should eat less fat, I think we should reduce dietary cholesterol, you know, we need to eat less of certain things. So that was a criticism it received. And around this time, well, before World War II, the biggest killers in America were basically deficiency diseases, infections, anything contagious, and a lot of stuff that killed people very acutely, very quickly, and infant mortality and that sort of thing. But after World War II, our sanitation practices became a lot better. We started whipping a lot of those infectious diseases into remission so they weren't killing people in such massive quantities anymore. And all of a sudden, people were living long enough to start dying from heart disease and cancer and those other so-called modern diseases. And so, no longer Americans benefiting from being told to eat more, which has been the USDA's message forever, because that's what farmers needed as well. All of a sudden, we needed to start eating less of certain things because we had a surplus, we had abundance, obesity was becoming a problem. And so the USDA was suddenly in this giant catch-22 because it had to decide whether it should keep Americans away from these foods that were becoming clearly not very healthy for us, or it could also be promoting those foods because that's what would make farmers happy. And so it had American health on one hand, agricultural health on the other hand, and it was like, well, we don't really know what to do now. And it's sort of been stuck in that catch-22 for decades now. And I think we can tell who won. If you look at what people are eating and what kinds of foods are being promoted by the government, it's clear that American health is not their priority. And that's very unfortunate. I think this is probably a more accurate food pyramid than anything they drew. And then the next big thing that happened for the USDA and for American health in general was the dietary goals for the United States, aka the McGovern Report. Did anyone hear about this? There's been like Good Calories, Bad Calories, if you've read that book. There are a few movies that kind of touch upon this. But basically in 1977, Senator McGovern, who's that guy up there, you can see how happy on his low-fat diet he looks, he decided to, well, he was actually in charge of the Senate Select Committee, which had been in operation for many years at that point. But the committee was in danger of getting disbanded. And so as a last-ditch effort to keep his people and keep his power, he decided, okay, we're gonna take everything we've done over the past few years and kind of scrap it together. We're gonna publish it in this thing called Dietary Goals for the United States. And what this document was for the first time, Americans were being told to eat less fat, especially saturated fat, less sugar, less sodium, less dietary cholesterol. And this is the first time in history that the USDA or anything affiliated with the government was telling people to eat less of something. And so this was a huge change. And the food industries were not amused because this was a major blow to them. And the USDA finally had to shift its message away from protecting against deficiency, which had been its main goal for so long, but now had to start preventing disease. And so this was a new territory for it. And the dietary goals, I don't have time to talk about this today, but it will be in my book. Not very scientific at all. It wasn't based on anything particularly solid. There's tons of controversy surrounding it, but nonetheless, it got published and it got implemented into public policy very quickly. So from that point forward, the USDA was stuck with its two conflicting missions, and one was to dispense nutrition advice that would make Americans actually be healthier, and the other thing was to, again, protect those agricultural interests. And one way I look at this is like, if you had to adopt like Wile E. Coyote and the Roadrunner as your children, and you're like, okay, I want you both to succeed. I'm gonna give you all the resources you need to succeed. You know, here, Wile E., here's your Acme Dynamite, here, Roadrunner, here's the times that the coyote's sleeping and whatnot. Both cannot win. One is going to kill the other one. And that's the same way, that's the same dynamic that's operating within the USDA, because their two conflicting missions are conflicting, basically. There's no way for them to really peacefully coexist. It's either going to be American health or it's going to be agricultural interests. Anyone know who Louise Light is? Nobody. No, I knew nobody would know about her because I didn't know about her either. And she's kind of, she's been lost in the pages of history, but she is an incredible woman. And she was actually hired in the 1970s to help create a replacement for the Basic 4 Food Guide. And she was called actually by the woman who had invented the Basic 4 herself. And she was called up on the phone one day. She was teaching at New York University in a post-grad position. And this woman who, the previous food guide person, called her up and said, I really want you to come take my place at the USDA. We need a new food guide. And Louise said, well, why don't you just stay, at your job long enough to finish, because this woman was going to retire. And she said, one food guide is enough for my lifetime. And Louise would soon find out what she meant by that. So she was hired to basically put together the next big set of guidelines for Americans. And what she did when she first got to the USDA, she spent months and months and months poring over all the studies that were available on diet disease. She convened groups of agricultural and biochemistry professors. She just hashed out all the details and came up with what she felt was a very good set of guidelines that would be workable for the American population. And so what she invented looked something like this. She thought that the basis of the American diet should be not grains, but fresh produce. And she recommended 5 to 9 servings of fresh fruits and vegetables per day. She did not succumb to the fat phobia that was gripping the rest of the nation. She actually thought that our diet should contain at least 4 tablespoons of cold-pressed fats and oils every single day. She thought we should eat about 5 to 7 ounces of protein foods like meat, beans, eggs, and nuts. She recommended about 2 to 3 servings of dairy, only 2 to 3 servings of grains, and always whole. She was very emphatic about that. And she felt that refined carbohydrates, even like rolls, bagels, crackers, sugar, white flour, sweetened cereals, they all belong to that tip of the pyramid that the youth sparingly tip or avoid completely. And so this was what she came up with after doing all of her research. So she was excited about that. And one interesting point is, according to Louise Light's food guide, 1 sandwich alone would fill the daily grain quotient for most women and less active men. Compare that to what the recommendations actually ended up being later. And she thought that a diet high in refined starches would promote obesity and diabetes. She was very strongly set in that opinion. And she thought the only people who needed a large intake of grains would be football players and longshoremen. And so she sent her guidelines off to the Secretary of Agriculture for approval. She had worked so hard on this, she had refined everything, she was really excited about it. And when it came back to her, changes had been made. So instead of her pyramid, and I should mention this actual design itself was not in place yet, but the serving sizes were, so that's why I put it up. Instead of 2 to 3 servings of grains, suddenly it was 6 to 11 servings of grains. Fruits and vegetables, originally pruned down to 2 to 3 servings total of fruits and vegetables per day. And it was only because the National Cancer Institute a few years later badgered the USDA to raise that amount because they thought that they'd be killing Americans by recommending such a low intake of fresh produce. But originally the USDA changed it to 2 to 3 servings total of those. Milk and meat and eggs and dairy, all that stuff, pretty much the same. That actually doesn't change too much. But all of a sudden, those fats and oils that Louise had felt would be very beneficial for Americans were up at the top to be used sparingly. And so, what happened, right? Even though she was really upset about this, Louise had to sign off on the new graphic because it was either that or she would lose her job. And even if she had protested, she was basically powerless to make changes because those changes had been made at the policy level. It was way above her head and there's nothing she could do about it. So the big question is, why were all those changes made? Light asked her boss about it. You know, she was just horrified about the changes, and the only thing she was told was that the federal recommendations needed to be based on grains instead of fruits and vegetables or anything else to keep the lid on food stamp program costs, because apparently everything else except for grains cost too much. And Light still didn't believe that. She felt like she was being played, but she never got a straight answer about any of it. And unfortunately, she passed away about 2 years ago, I think, of bladder cancer. I was trying my darndest to hunt her down for an interview, and I didn't realize she had passed away. But I did talk to her daughter, and her daughter said that she took many secrets about the USDA with her to the grave. So we'll never quite know what those are, unfortunately. And her conclusion about what had happened was that all those changes were a concession to the processed wheat and corn industries, because she felt like the USDA was so much on that side of things that they really needed to promote those refined grain foods to Americans and feed them to us so that profits could be made. And if anyone else is, or if anyone's interested in hearing a little bit more about this, Louise has a book out called What to Eat. I think it was published in 2006, and it's not very well known at all. There's actually another book by the same title that came out the same year by Marion Nestle, who's a lot more famous. But I really enjoyed Louise's book, and in fact, something kind of interesting, in her later years, she hosted a radio program based in Vermont, and in a couple of her shows, she indicated that she was a Weston A. Price fan. And so she actually, imagine somebody working from the USDA who eventually migrated over to Weston A. Price. I just think that's ironic on so many levels. I love it. So something else kind of interesting. Among the things we have stolen from Sweden, the list does not end at IKEA and Ingrid Bergman. We actually took the pyramid design from Sweden itself. And the first food pyramid was actually a Swedish invention made in 1974 in response to a ton of riots that were breaking out in the streets of Stockholm. I think it was like 6,000 protesters assembled one day to just really try to get the government to do something about these skyrocketing food prices. And so the sole goal of this pyramid that you can see up on the left was to create a dirt cheap menu that was nutritionally sufficient. There was no thought really about long-term health. It was more like, we need to feed people something, so we're just gonna do this by cheapness. And so what their pyramid ended up being was remarkably similar to what the USDA's pyramid ended up being. And that is, it was based on cheap commodities like bread, potatoes, pasta, margarine, and fruits and vegetables in the middle, which were a little bit more expensive, and then pricier meat products were up at the apex. And at the time, it was actually criticized for its emphasis on breads and starches, because Swedes, especially nutritionists who were in Sweden, thought that it would promote nationwide obesity, this pyramid. Nonetheless, it was implemented. And then back in America, it actually took over a decade after Louise started working at the USDA before we even started designing an actual visual for it. And I think that's just a testament to the quickness that our government works at. We're a little bit slow. But in 1988, the design process began, and a whole bunch of different designs were tested. The pyramid, a bowl shape, a wheel shape, different stuff. Tested on consumers to see which would be most effective. And eventually, the nutritionists who were working on this decided on what they called the Eating Right Pyramid, and it was supposed to be released in April of 1991. And in fact, it was so close to being released that it was actually at the printer, getting its color adjusted, and there were 1 million copies ready to be distributed everywhere. But at the last minute, the Secretary of Agriculture at the time, who was named Edward Madigan, decided to halt the production because, in his words, he was worried that the pyramid would be confusing to children. And that is baloney. It's not confusing to anybody. What had really happened was he had just had a meeting with the National Cattlemen's Association, and they were peeved that meat was up on top near where all the bad foods are. Dairy industry was really upset too. They were like, our products are going to get stigmatized because they're up near the, the use sparingly tip. So the USDA crumbled at that point, and they're like, okay, well, we'll retract the pyramid, we'll work on it some more until you're happy. And so 1 year went by, almost $1 million tax dollars were spent on this, and then the pyramid was published with only superficial changes, like the cheese slice got some holes in it so that it wouldn't look like a cake slice, and there's a bowl of macaroni noodles that turned into a spaghetti bowl, and then I forget some other stuff, like the chopsticks turned from like purple to green. It was just ridiculous that they spent this much money to make so few changes. Another thing they changed was they changed the title away from the Eating Right Pyramid to the Food Guide Pyramid. And that was because Kraft Foods had trademarked the Eating Right slogan, and they were really mad at the USDA for taking its words. And not only that, but its competitor, ConAgra Foods, they were really mad because they thought the Eating Right slogan was going to give Kraft an advantage because it would be on that pyramid. So it's like the food industries are just fighting all over the place about this. And the meat and dairy industries ended up being happy enough because the USDA went through all these testing processes that showed that people would not be abandoning meat and dairy products and like switching to tofu or anything, despite being up there near the top. And so once the pyramid was officially out there, it received a lot of criticism. And people were really confused because they were like, well, the stuff at the top of the pyramid is supposed to be the best, but here we have the stuff we're supposed to avoid. And it was just, like the whole hierarchy structure was really confusing for some reason. And the Washington Post journalist, Candy Sagan, actually wrote something kind of funny. In an article where she was discussing the pyramid, she said, the Egyptians built pyramids for dead people. A year ago, the US Department of Agriculture chose a pyramid for its food guide. Is there a message here? I think we probably know the answer to that too. And then not only that, but scientists were also concerned because they thought that the whole lack of fat thing was going to be very detrimental to Americans who wouldn't be getting enough fatty acids, and they were also worried that this whole eat grains of any sort on the bottom was going to make people less healthy by raising their triglycerides, lowering their HDL, and doing all sorts of other bad stuff. So it was receiving a lot of criticism on all fronts, pretty much as soon as it emerged. And not only that, this is terribly embarrassing, so I wanted to show it to you. This is, and I apologize if you probably can't read those words, so I'll read them for you. But this was something called the Hard to Place Food Pyramid that was published as part of a packet by Penn State Nutrition Center. And it was widely used by dietitians to help teach their clients what they should be eating and how to identify foods that didn't really fit naturally into a certain category. And so these nutritionists, who we're supposed to trust, decided that grain servings could count as any of the following: cake or sugar cone, cheese balls, cheese curls, cheese crackers, croutons, cookies, fried corn chips, microwave popcorn, pie crust, popcorn balls, rice cakes, taco shells, Yorkshire pudding. Vegetables, those are a little better, but it also included things like mashed potatoes, pickles, potato chips, shoestring potatoes. Those are all vegetables. Potatoes, potato chips, vegetables. Fruit group included things like avocado, which is odd because that's a fat, so they should have hated it. Fruit juice, maraschino cherries, which I don't even know why they put that in the fruit group either. And then the milk, yogurt, and cheese group, if you want your dairy servings, that could include custard, frozen yogurt, ice cream, prepared instant breakfast, rice pudding, tapioca. Seriously. And meat, poultry, fish, that group included things like hot dogs, processed meats. And then for some reason, at the top of the pyramid, the stuff you're supposed to avoid, opposed to all that other stuff, which apparently you can eat abundantly, included bacon. So bacon got relegated to the top for bacon. Cream cheese also, and whereas ice cream was in the dairy group, for whatever reason cream cheese was in the sparingly group. I don't know. Whipping cream was at the top, more stuff like that. Gelatin, I don't even know why gelatin would be up there. But anyway, this was widely dispersed. It was published in the Journal of the American Dietetic Association at the time, and it received some backlash too, but not as much as it should have. I think it's kind of horrifying. But anyway, this is essentially what our food pyramid is on a practical level. This is what it consists of, and that just scares the heck out of me. So, cereal boxes, all of them had that food pyramid logo, other boxes too, cookbooks, textbooks, they made bingo cards with the food pyramid on it. They made like board games based on the food pyramid. It was just all over the place. And that was very intentional on the part of the USDA. They really wanted it to just be indoctrinated in every single person. And so schools also were required to teach it and just preach its gospel all over the place. And not only that, but the school lunch programs, food stamp programs, hospital meals, daycare snacks, and other nutrition programs, they all had to conform to the pyramid's advice. And so that's the reason you had to eat like soggy brownies and like disgusting pizza crust in your school meals. It was because they were trying to give you more grains to fit into that 6 to 11 servings each day. And again, brownies also count as a grain serving, so that's why you do those too, if you remember those. And so this pyramid was in place until 2005. So it was a good long run. It was 12 years or so, no longer than that, it was 13 or so. And then what happened after that? We had, what the heck is this? We had my pyramid, which baffled everybody. It's like, okay, we got these random color stripes with no identification. We have this figure jogging up some stairs. Is that supposed to be a Rocky reference? I don't know. And just, nobody understood what to do with this. And so my pyramid, I call it my disaster. Critics pointed out that first of all, there was no way to tell what color represented what food stripe, how much foods of anything you should be eating. This was not even anything about food. It's like it was supposed to be a food guide, but the only thing it showed was exercise, so it's just massively confusing. And why is that stick man trying to get the top where all the bad foods are? I don't know what they're trying to tell us with that, really. Maybe it's a subliminal message. Oh yeah, keep eating those refined everythings. And then the worst problem was that my pyramid alienated the people who needed nutrition advice the most. And those are the people who don't have access or steady access to computers and the internet, which is the only place you can go to decipher what like the My Pyramid mystery is. Because that's the whole thing. It has their little URL down there and it's like, well, here's our logo. Now you're supposed to go online and click a bunch of JavaScript stuff and figure out what you're supposed to be eating. And of course, who wants to really do that? And in fact, the USDA, they did such a poor job with their My Pyramid website that on the first day it was launched, it crashed within 20 minutes. Its servers were like completely down and people were trying to log on and nothing was happening and people were freaking out. And so it kind of failed massively from the start. And then, not surprisingly, they kind of gave that the boot a few years ago in 2011. And then the next thing that happened was MyPlate, which, you know, at least there's no like stick man with no feet on this one, but it was still really confusing and totally non-specific about what we should be eating. Like, what's fruit? Does that count as like a fruit roll-up like it would in that last pyramid? Grains? How about a Twinkie there? You know, dairy? Chocolate milk? Why not? You know, protein? That's not even food. What are you supposed to eat for protein? You don't see like a slab of protein grazing on grass anywhere. Why don't they actually say specific food there? And so this too also received a lot of criticism. It received a lot of criticism again for that whole, like, well, we don't know how much to eat, we don't know whether our grain should be refined or not, there's just nothing specific about it. So the USDA has kind of been bouncing between this like, well, should we give you specific, like very detailed instructions about what to eat that you'll ignore, or should we simplify and then not give you anything beneficial? So it's kind of been a challenge for the USDA. And unfortunately, it is going to be this way forever, because as long as it's dual messages, the whole, you know, promote human health versus promote agricultural interests, as long as the USDA is in charge of both of those things, it's going to be stuck in this jam, this deadlock, where it can't really fulfill either mission completely. And the other thing is that the USDA can never tell us that any food is bad for us. And if you look through any food guide, you'll never see the words like avoid completely or eliminate or, you know, eat a whole lot less of, because anytime the USDA changes wording like that, whatever industry is being affected, they lose millions of dollars immediately, no joke. And so the USDA is kind of hemmed in by all these industry pressures where it has to be very careful with the way it chooses words. So instead of, like, when they want us to decrease saturated fat, they won't say eat less saturated fat, they'll say emphasize lean meats, and then they'll just kind of hope that takes care of everything. And so again, if you look through any food guide, you'll never see the words eliminate or avoid. You just see things like in moderation or choose wisely, which sounds like it could come from a fortune cookie, so it's just very useless. And our latest guidelines from 2010 still allow up to half of our grains, that 6 to 11 servings, to be refined, even though there's zero evidence that we need that, and there's plenty of evidence that that's very harmful. But if they ever tell us, stick to only whole grains, again, industries are going to lose massive, massive, massive amounts of money. And the other issue with this too is some people say, well, okay, well, we can't trust the USDA, but what about these other big organizations like the American Dietetic Association, American Heart Association? They seem more legit, right? Have you ever gone to the American Dietetic Association's website and looked at their corporate sponsors and partners? Because this is what it looks like. Corporate partners include Coca-Cola, Hershey's. In fact, just a few years ago, the ADA partnered with Hershey's to create a Moderation Nation campaign where they were telling people to eat more chocolate candy because of the health benefits of cocoa, and it was so obviously driven by Hershey trying to get more money. National Dairy Council, so of course they're going to always be pushing low-fat milk with every meal. And then their corporate sponsors, where they get millions of dollars of money each year, includes General Mills, Kellogg's, Soyjoy, PepsiCo. Do you really want to be taking advice from these people? Oh, it's terrible. And what's even worse is that even the root of everything we think we know about health, which is our scientific base, even that is tainted by industry influences. And this is the part that really scares me, because I love science and I expect it to be reliable. And there's a good chance that it not always is, especially when it comes to nutritional science. There was a study done just in 2007, one of the first of its kind, that showed, or there were some researchers, I think they were from Harvard, and they were working at Children's Hospital, and they looked at 200 papers on heavily marketed beverages like milk, juice, and soda, and they took a look at industry funding for these studies, and they compared the ones that were receiving a lot of industry funding to ones that weren't receiving any industry funding. And what they found was that studies with full industry funding were almost 8 times more likely to report a positive outcome of their studies for their product than the studies that weren't funded by industry at all. So that's a pretty good indication that either when there's some kind of financial influence there, they're either kind of pushing the results to be a certain way, or they're suppressing results that don't say quite what they want, but there's something shady going on with that. And not only that, but not a single industry-funded intervention trial with any of these beverages showed a negative outcome for the product. But when the trials were not funded by industry, 37% showed a negative outcome for that product. So again, it's a little scary. Same thing goes for GMO. If you guys, anyone see the GMO talks today, how many of you feel comfortable eating a tomato spliced with frog genes? Yum, right? No, and the scary part is that when people do GMO studies, about half of them are conducted by at least one author who is actually affiliated with a GMO corporation. And most GMO studies don't even declare their funding source because they're so directly coming from those GMO sources that they don't really want to reveal it. And something a little bit scary is that when a study author has GMO industry affiliation, that study is almost guaranteed to show a positive outcome for the product, to show that the GMO product isn't harmful, that it's healthy for people, that it's nutritious. So that's a little scary. And then when there's no professional conflicts of interest, like when it's actually being an independent study of a GMO product, about a quarter of GMO studies show that there's something unhealthy about the product. And that information is just completely buried as soon as industry influences are there. So it's scary, it's very scary stuff. And is there any hope for the future? No, I don't think so. The USDA is trapped right now. It's trapped in its position where it can't tell us the stuff we really need to be healthy without upsetting those agricultural interests. There's just no way it can be completely honest about human nutrition and also keep the other people happy, keep the farm industries happy. And industry pressures, of course, as you just saw, also infect the scientific research that we're drawing from and that we're trying to derive truth from, which is just terrifying on so many levels. And my only recommendation for everyone in this room right now and everyone in the whole country, really, is to ditch government advice and do what this conference is all about, really. Look at healthy populations. Look at what people have done right in the past. Look at what they're doing right now. Don't look at our sick American population and just try to figure out what they're doing wrong. That's not as good a strategy. Federal advice is always going to have an agenda, and that it's not something that's ever going to change, probably in any of our lifetimes. So sorry to be a Debbie Downer on that last note, but just be very cautious with the information you're getting from the USDA and anything that looks like a pyramid or my plate or anything like that. Just take it all with a grain of salt and keep eating your salt too, because that's probably not bad for you either. Thank you so much. And if you have any questions, I would be happy to take them. Yeah.
The Louise lady that you were talking about, I came in late. What was her last name?
Oh, my last name is Minger, M-I-N-G-E-R.
Louise.
Oh, Louise? Louise Light.
Light?
Light, yeah, let me go back to that.
Just L-I-G-H-T.
Yeah.
Okay, just
Like light and dark.
Right.
All right, thank you.
Sure. Anybody else got questions? I know you're all tired, yeah.
Did you try looking for a direct link between government spending and health education and negative health outcomes for the U.S.?
I didn't look, actually I looked briefly for something like that. I looked briefly for something like that, but I couldn't find any actual data on it. I wouldn't be surprised if there is some kind of interplay with that, but as far as I know, I haven't seen any data on it. That's a good question.
Okay, what is your solution then? Instead of this, the USDA, what do we do?
My whole thing is about being self-informed, self-educated, and do your own research on things. I think what is going to benefit people the most is learning how to think critically about the things you hear about nutrition and inform yourself enough so that you are not taken in by the food pyramids that you see. Just really you have to think for yourself because other people are not going to think for you in the correct way. Yeah. Nations have food guides that are very, very similar to America's. There are some that people have created as alternatives, like actually the Harvard School of Health has invented like a Mediterranean-style pyramid. I know Canada's is like almost identical to the US. They might be a little bit different, like France, hopefully a little more fat-heavy over there just because they have so much good stuff. But for the most part, when I've looked at them, Australia, the same, very similar to the US. It's all very similar. There's nothing too hugely different among different countries that I've seen. Yeah. Anybody else? Going once, going twice. So